Have you ever read a book or watched a movie and you felt like you didn't really understand the main point? Maybe you even tried asking someone else for their opinion, or you searched on internet, but it still felt unclear. Well, you're not alone, because understanding complex ideas takes a lot of patience and, most importantly, a good method. In this video, I will show you not only how to read and understand, but even to engage with the most complex text. Hello everyone, I'm Ivan. I'm a PhD fellow at the University of Freiburg in Germany, and I'm the founder of Empyrean Academy. I completed my bachelor's and master's degree in Milan, in Italy, where over 5 years I absorbed the Italian method of studies and approaching philosophy. At the moment I'm pursuing a PhD in Germany, where I focus intensely on classical German philosophy. In this video I will use my expertise and all the years of international experience to show you how to approach and analyze a highly complex text. I'm talking about the Prolegomena of Any Future Metaphysics by Immanuel Kant. To give you a quick context, Immanuel Kant is considered one of the greatest philosophers of all time, particularly for having changed completely our perspective of understanding the world through the so-called Copernican revolution. In this video, we will analyze the first pages of the preface of the Kantian Prolegomena, where he presents his whole project. Before reading the preface, let's focus for a moment on the title of this text. The purpose of a title is usually to summarize the content of the whole text in just a few concepts. The title of this text is Prolegomena to Any Future Metaphysics that will be able to come forward as science. We have three main concepts in this title. The first one is Prolegomena. Prolegomena is a word that comes from Latin and it means a preliminary introduction or exposition. And this is the first information that we gain about this text. It's going to be a sort of exposition. Important is to focus for a second on this preposition here. As we can see, the preposition is to, and it has an instrumental value. So what it means is that this prolegomena, this preliminary introduction or exposition, is not going to be an exposition of a science, of metaphysics, but rather it's going to be at the service of metaphysics. As Kant writes, they are intended to any metaphysics that wants to come forward as science, that wants to present itself, that wants to become a science. Now the second important concept is indeed the metaphysics. What is metaphysics and why does Kant talk about metaphysics anyway? In the Western tradition, metaphysics is considered the most fundamental science, or as Kant defines it, the queen of all sciences. The reason is related to the object of metaphysics, which is considered the most underlying object of all sciences, namely the being itself. While all the other sciences concentrate and focus on a certain domain of this being or from a certain perspective, for instance, biology has to do with living organisms, physics has to do with the physical matter, metaphysics addresses its research to the being as such. It is therefore something that in this sense unifies and underlines all knowledge. The first and last important concept about this text is the concept of science. Based on what we just said, it seems a contradiction, the fact that metaphysics has to present or wants to present itself in terms of science. If metaphysics is the queen of sciences, then why does it want to present itself as science? What does Kant mean by this? Let's for a moment suspend this question, because by reading the preface it will become clear the reason why metaphysics wants to present itself as science. In general, when you're reading a text, always try to ask yourself questions. Maybe write them on a notebook and keep them nearby. It's important to collect these questions because by reading the text and reading it all over time again, the answers will become eventually clearer. Now let's begin with the preface of the text. These prolegomena are not for the use of apprentices or for the future teachers, and indeed are not to help them to organize the presentation of an already existing science, but to discover this science itself for the first time. In this very first paragraph, Kant tells us something very interesting, namely the fact that this text is not aimed to scholars but rather to future teachers. Why? because it's not a simple exposition of an already existing science, but rather, as we already seen in the title thanks to this to preposition, it is a fundamental tool that allows the future teachers to discover this science for the first time. So Kant talks about teachers not because they have to be officially teachers, but because they need to have this attitude of willing to teach and discover. This is the reason why I find this text extremely pedagogically valuable, and therefore I always suggest it to the students of my academy. Speaking of which, if you are interested in philosophy and you want to know a little bit more about the Western tradition of metaphysics and at the same time you want to learn to think critically on a certain author, we are organizing a course about the critique of metaphysics through 4 fundamental authors: Kant, Kierkegaard, Nietzsche and Heidegger. If you'd like to know a bit more, leave a comment down below or visit our website through the link in the description. Now let's get back to the text. In this paragraph, Kant confirms what we already anticipated from the first paragraph. He criticizes the historian of philosophy for 2 fundamental reasons. The first reason is that it must wait until those who endeavor to draw from the wellsprings of reason itself have finished their business. This means that they merely collect the thoughts of the real philosophers without engaging with the history of thought. The second point is that, in their opinion, nothing can be said that has not already been said before. The reason why they only collect the thoughts of other philosophers is that they have this very fatalistic perspective of history. They believe that everything worth saying has already been said in the past. I think this perspective that Kant criticizes is very interesting because it's the same one that we adopt nowadays. And I believe it becomes stronger the more we advance and make progress in history by discovering new things. This perspective makes sense if we consider philosophy in terms of a quantity science that only collects information throughout the history. But of course, from Kant's perspective, this doesn't make sense. Indeed, he criticizes the historians of philosophy. Philosophy, as Kant is trying to explain, has to do with the beginnings, namely the discovery and rediscovery of the things. So it's not about collecting informations, but rather delving deeper into questions and understanding. In the next paragraph, Kant states his intention. My intention is to convince all of those who find it worthwhile to occupy themselves with metaphysics that it is unavoidably necessary to suspend their work for the present, to consider all that has happened until now as if it had not happened, and before else to pose the question whether such a thing as metaphysics is even possible at all. From this we can understand 2 fundamental points. Metaphysics is very important to Kant, otherwise he wouldn't dedicate an entire text just to question its possibility. The second point is that even though metaphysics is important to Kant, he doesn't adopt a dogmatic perspective. On the contrary, he takes a critical stance. That is, he doesn't assume its possibility, but rather questions it. The word possible or possibility in Kantian philosophy and dictionary is very important because it has to do with his transcendental philosophy. In the next paragraph, Kant begins by asking 2 important questions. Always pay attention to the questions of the author because as much as we address our reading through the questions, the author as well addresses his explanations through these questions. So Kant writes, if metaphysics is a science, why is it that it cannot, as other sciences, attain universal lasting acclaim? If it's not, how does it happen that under the pretense of a science it incessantly shows off and strings along the human understanding with hopes that never dim but are never fulfilled? So as we see from these questions, Kant makes a sort of out-out. On one hand, if metaphysics is a science, why hasn't it succeeded like the other ones? On the other hand, if metaphysics is not a science, why does it arrogantly present itself as one? In the following lines, as we can see, Kant is trying to emphasize the fact that this problem has not been solved until now. Indeed, he writes, for things cannot possibly remain on their present footing. The same statement will be expressed clearer some years later in the second preface of the Critique of Pure Reason. The essential issue here is the one we already mentioned. The sciences progress while metaphysics, which aspires to be the ultimate form of knowledge, remains stagnant. Now let's try to summarize Kant's project. Metaphysics is the most important science, but it makes no progress. Meanwhile, the sciences do make progress. This answers two of our questions. Metaphysics remains the fundamental science, but because it does not progress, we must suspend all research to first ask whether it is even possible. The second point is, metaphysics does not progress, while the sciences do. It is for this reason that metaphysics needs to present itself in terms of science. How can metaphysics present itself as science? It must have solid foundations on which to build the progress. Through this text, Kant will try to give a new ground to metaphysics, which are indeed these tools, the Prolegomena. Thus, Kant will not deal directly with metaphysics. Instead, as he writes in a letter to his friend Marcus Hertz, he will attempt a sort of metaphysics of metaphysics. For this reason, whenever I try to read and interpret Kant in his main text Critique of Pure Reason, always keep in mind this idea, namely the fact that Kant is attempting to create the conditions under which a metaphysics could become possible and could turn into a science. Thank you for watching this video. This is Empyreon, the Academy of Philosophy and Fine Arts.